In 1968, a man sitting in a Philadelphia office signed a piece of paper and handed his company to a conglomerate that manufactured explosive circuit boards and coating compounds. He was 49 years old. He had spent 13 years building something the American audio industry had never quite seen before. And on the day he signed, the company had already produced the best-selling tube amplifier in the history of high-fidelity sound. The conglomerate's name was Dynaco Laboratories. It had acquired 6 companies that year alone. Dynaco was one of them. The others made explosive fabrication equipment, industrial coatings, and digital devices. In the quarterly report, they all looked the same. A decade earlier, that amplifier, 35 watts per channel, 4 output tubes, a pre-assembled circuit board, and a price that a factory worker could reach in a month's wages, had opened the door to serious listening for an entire generation of Americans who had been told implicitly and explicitly that the best sound was reserved for people who could afford the best price. How does the amplifier that puts serious sound into 1 million American living rooms end up as a line item in a conglomerate's quarterly report? That is the question. This is the story. In 1950, serious sound cost serious money. A Macintosh MC30 monaural amplifier, one of the finest American-built tube amplifiers of the post-war era, sold for well over $200. A pair of them for stereo doubled that figure. Add a preamplifier, an FM tuner, and a pair of loudspeakers capable of doing justice to the amplification, and a working American family was looking at a system that cost more than a used car. The men who designed these machines were brilliant. The machines themselves were magnificent. And for the vast majority of Americans who cared about how music sounded in their own homes, they were completely out of reach. This was not an accident. It was the structure of the market. High-fidelity audio in post-war America existed in 2 distinct worlds. In one world, there were brands like Macintosh Marantz and Altec Lansing companies that built to a standard, charged accordingly, and sold to a clientele that could absorb the price without particular difficulty. Their amplifiers sat in the living rooms of physicians, lawyers, and engineers. Their names appeared in the pages of High Fidelity magazine, alongside advertisements for imported wines and European travel. They were in every functional sense luxury goods dressed in technical clothing. In the other world, there were the rest. Budget receivers and integrated amplifiers that compressed the cost by compressing the performance instruments that could fill a room with sound but could not do what the Macintosh could do, could not render the texture of a bow drawn across a string or the specific weight of a piano chord sustained in an empty hall. The gap between the 2 worlds was real, measurable, and for most Americans, impassable. David Hafler had grown up in West Philadelphia. He had studied mathematics at the University of Pennsylvania. He had served as a communications specialist in the Coast Guard during the Second World War, and had come home in 1945 with the same mix of electronics knowledge and restless practical intelligence that characterized an entire generation of American veterans who had spent years keeping military communication equipment operational under conditions that did not permit failure. He was not a dreamer. He was a problem solver. And the problem he identified was not technical. It was economic. The technology to build a high-quality amplifier was not proprietary. It was not secret. The circuit designs that powered a Macintosh were at their core variations on principles that had been published in British and American technical journals throughout the late 1940s. A British engineer named D.T.N. Williamson had described a high-performance amplifier circuit in the pages of Wireless World beginning in 1947. Another British engineer, Alan Blumlein, had developed an output stage circuit of exceptional efficiency that reduced distortion by feeding part of the transformer's signal back through the output tube's screen grids. The knowledge existed. What did not exist in 1950 was a way to put that knowledge in the hands of the American listener who wanted to use it but could not pay a premium manufacturer to do it for him. In 1950, Hafler co-founded Acrosound with his colleague Herbert Karros in Philadelphia. The company's initial focus was narrow and deliberate output transformers for tube amplifiers sold to hobbyists who were building their own equipment. Acrosound's transformers incorporated the ultralinear output stage principle, refining and commercially distributing what Blumlein had originated, and they quickly became a standard component among the community of American electronics hobbyists who were building amplifiers from scratch in their basements and spare rooms, following schematics published in radio electronics and audio magazines, ordering parts through the mail, and assembling equipment that could genuinely compete with commercial products costing several times as much. This hobbyist culture was not a fringe phenomenon in early 1950s America. It was a direct expression of the same hands-on technical tradition that had produced generations of American radio builders, ham operators, and self-taught engineers. The men who built their own amplifiers in 1952 were the same men who had built their own crystal radio sets in 1935 and their own shortwave receivers in 1941. They were comfortable with a soldering iron. They could read a schematic. What they needed was not instruction. It was components and designs, and someone willing to sell those components at a price that made the project viable. Acrosound provided the transformers. Hafler's articles in Radio Electronics provided the designs, and in the process, a proposition began to take shape, one that Hafler's partner Karros did not entirely share. What if the kit was not the compromise? What if the kit was the product? Karros opposed the idea of moving from transformer sales into full amplifier kit production. The rift was real, and by 1954 the partnership was over. Hafler left Acrosound with the conviction that had made the argument irreconcilable that a carefully engineered, clearly documented, partially pre-assembled kit could deliver genuine high-fidelity performance to any American willing to spend a weekend building it, and that the savings from eliminating factory assembly could close the gap between what serious sound cost and what a serious listener could actually afford. He needed an engineer to help him build it. He found one in New York City at a company called Brosiner Electronics, where a designer named Ed Laurent was working on power amplifier circuits. The two men recognized something in each other's approach. By the fall of 1955, they had a plan, a company name and an address on the north side of Philadelphia. What they did not yet have was a product. That was about to change. The Dynaco Company was incorporated in October 1955. The address was 617 North 41st Street, Philadelphia, a modest commercial space in a neighborhood of row houses and small manufacturing operations on the west side of the city, close enough to the University of Pennsylvania that the intellectual infrastructure of the place was available, and far enough from the premium end of the American audio market that nobody was watching too closely. The first product was a 50-watt monaural power amplifier. Hafler and Laurent called it the Mark II, a designation that implied an established lineage the company did not yet have. There was no Mark I. The name was a statement of confidence or perhaps of ambition, in the same way that Porsche had numbered its first production car the 356. It suggested that something had come before, that this was an iteration rather than an origin. In practice, it was the beginning of everything. The Mark II used EL34 output tubes, a beam power pentode originally developed for European radio transmitter applications capable of delivering high output power with relatively low distortion when operated within its design envelope. The EL34 was not an American tube. It was manufactured primarily by Mullard in Britain and Philips in the Netherlands. But its sonic character, a warmth in the mid-range, a particular smoothness at the upper frequencies, a controlled and musical quality when the amplifier was driven toward its limits, was exactly what Hafler and Laurent needed for the performance level they were targeting. The Mark II incorporated Dynaco's own ultralinear output transformers, the direct descendants of the Acrosound designs that had already established Hafler's reputation among American hobbyists. It was available two ways as a factory-assembled unit tested and ready to connect, or as a Dynakit, a box containing all the required components including pre-assembled and pre-tested printed circuit boards, with the customer responsible only for the external wiring that connected the boards to the transformers, the power supply, and the chassis hardware. Hafler's critical innovation was that pre-assembled circuit board. Other kit manufacturers of the period required the builder to stuff and solder the circuit boards themselves, a task that demanded skill, patience, and a reliable soldering iron, and that introduced significant opportunity for error. Dynaco eliminated that step. The board arrived ready. The assembly that remained was mechanical, not electronic. A careful person with moderate technical confidence and a willingness to follow instructions could complete it successfully. Hafler's instruction manuals became legendary in the hobbyist community almost immediately. They were written in plain English, organized, logically illustrated clearly, and designed with the assumption that the reader was intelligent, but not necessarily an electronics professional. This was not a minor detail. It was the other half of the product. A kit that arrived with an incomprehensible manual was not an affordable amplifier. It was an expensive frustration. A kit that arrived with Dynaco's manual was something a working man could build on his kitchen table over a long weekend and have operating before the next Monday morning. At launch, the kit savings over the assembled price ran to 30 or 40%. For a product in a category where the competitive alternatives cost 2 to 3 times as much fully assembled, that differential was not a discount. It was an argument. The Mark II sold, not modestly, and not only to the existing hobbyist community. It reached musicians, engineers, teachers, and working-class families who had read about high-fidelity sound in Popular Mechanics or radio electronics, and had decided on the basis of Dynaco's pricing that the category was now accessible to them. By some accounts, the Mark II was selling approximately 1,000 units per month at its peak, a figure that would have been remarkable for a premium assembled amplifier at the same price, and that was extraordinary for a product that required the customer to participate in its own manufacture. The company outgrew its first address quickly. Dynaco relocated to 3912 Powelton Avenue, a former chocolate factory in the Powelton Village neighborhood of West Philadelphia, a Victorian-era district of brick row houses and converted commercial buildings that sat between the University of Pennsylvania to the south and the Drexel Institute to the east. The building retained from its previous incarnation a large walk-in refrigerator, the kind that had once been used to store chocolate inventory at controlled temperatures. Hafler and Laurent converted it into a listening room. The insulated walls that had once kept cocoa butter from melting now provided acoustic isolation from the street noise outside. It was improvised, practical, and entirely characteristic of how the company operated the available resource repurposed for the precise need at hand without apology and without ceremony. In 1956, the Mark II was succeeded by the Mark III 60 watts, a choke-filtered power supply for lower hum and improved regulation, and the option of KT88 output tubes for those who wanted even more headroom. A companion mono preamplifier, the PAM1, appeared in 1957, powered directly from an octal socket on the amplifier chassis. A complete mono high-fidelity system amplifier preamplifier could now be purchased from a single catalog built on the same table and connected with a straightforward wiring procedure that the manual made genuinely achievable. At 3912 Powelton Avenue, in a converted chocolate factory with a walk-in refrigerator for a listening room, something was taking shape that the American audio market had not quite encountered before. Not a luxury product with an aspirational price, not a budget compromise with audible limitations. Something in between, or rather something that refused the premise that in between was the only available position. In 1959, the stereo era arrived, and Dynaco was ready for it. In November 1957, a record label called Audio Fidelity released the first commercially available stereophonic disc in the United States. It contained a Dixieland band on one side and a steam locomotive on the other. The sound quality was by later standards modest, but the fact of it, 2 channels of audio information pressed into a single groove recoverable by a compatible cartridge and rendered through 2 separate amplification paths into 2 separate speakers changed the geometry of every living room in America that took music seriously. The problem was immediate and practical. A monaural amplifier could not play a stereo record in stereo. 2 monaural amplifiers could, but the cost doubled. The complexity increased, and the matching requirements between channels introduced new variables that most home builders found difficult to manage. What the stereo era required was a single chassis carrying 2 complete amplification paths. A stereo power amplifier built to the same standard of performance that Dynaco had established with the Mark II and Mark III, and priced within reach of the same audience. David Hafler, Ed Laurent, and an engineer named Bob Tucker began the design work in 1958. What they produced was not a compromise between 2 Mark II circuits squeezed onto one chassis. It was a purpose-designed stereo amplifier that used the available space and the shared power supply to deliver something more coherent than 2 separate monoblocks would have provided at the same total price. The Stereo 70, designated the ST70 in Dynaco's catalog, launched in 1959. Its circuit was built around 4 EL34 output tubes, 1 GZ34 rectifier tube, and 2 7199 driver tubes. Each channel received 2 EL34s, operating in push-pull ultra-linear configuration. A circuit arrangement in which the 2 output tubes handle alternating halves of the audio waveform, with the ultralinear transformer taps reducing distortion by feeding a portion of the output signal back to the screen grids of the output tubes. The result was an amplifier that measured cleanly, ran reliably, and delivered 35 watts per channel into an 8-ohm load. 35 watts does not sound like a large number. In the listening rooms of the early 1960s, with the loudspeaker sensitivities of the period, speakers that converted amplifier power into acoustic output far more efficiently than most modern designs, 35 watts per channel was sufficient to fill a domestic room at any volume a reasonable person would choose to listen at, with power to spare. The limiting factor in most domestic systems of that era was not amplifier power. It was amplifier quality. And on that measure, the ST70's design left very little to criticize. The EL34 output tube deserves a specific description because it is central to what the ST70 sounded like and why that sound mattered. The EL34 is a beam power pentode, a tube in which electrons are focused into a beam by internal electrode geometry, allowing high power output with relatively low plate voltage. When an EL34 amplifier is operated within its linear range, it is clean and extended with a smoothness in the upper mid-range that distinguishes it from American-designed output tubes like the 6L6. When it is driven beyond that linear range, when the signal demands more than the tube can deliver without distortion, the EL34 clips gradually and musically, introducing harmonic content that most listeners experience as warmth rather than harshness. This is not an accident of physics. It is the reason the ST70 sounded the way it did, and the reason it continued to sound that way to a listener's ear long after a measurement instrument might have registered the distortion. The kit price at launch was $99.95, tube cover included. The factory-assembled price was $129.95. In December 1959, the Hirsch-Hauck Laboratories reviewed the ST70 in High Fidelity magazine and reported that its components were operated more conservatively than those in any other commercial amplifier they had tested. that its power and distortion ratings were completely conservative, and that its listening quality was unsurpassed. Dynaco reprinted those words in its own advertisements for years afterward. They did not need to embellish them. In September 1964, a young man named Bob Latino drove to the Lafayette radio store on Foster Street in Worcester, Massachusetts, and purchased a Dynakit ST70 with all tubes and a tube cage for $89.95. He brought the box home. He spread the components on the family kitchen table. It took 3 days to complete the assembly. Every evening, his mother made him clear everything off the table so the family could eat supper. On the third day, he connected an FM tuner to the amplifier's input terminals, switched it on, and it worked. He did not have a preamplifier yet. That would take a few more weeks of saving. But the amplifier worked on the first attempt built by a young man with no professional electronics training, following an instruction manual that Dynaco had written, with the assumption that its customers were intelligent people who deserved to be treated as such. That story, or a version of it set in a different city in a different year, with a different radio station playing through the tuner, was repeated tens of thousands of times across the United States throughout the 1960s. In college apartments and starter homes, in the spare bedrooms of rented houses, and on the workbenches of men who had come home from Korea with the same practical electronics instinct that Hafler himself had brought home from the Second World War. The Dynakit box arrived, the manual was followed, the amplifier worked, and then the music played in a room where serious music had never played before at that quality, through a system that its owner had built with his own hands. This was the thing that no premium manufacturer could replicate. Not the circuit, not the specifications. The experience of building it and the specific quality of attention that a man brings to a piece of equipment he assembled himself component by component, wire by wire, over the course of a long weekend. By 1963, the ST70 had a worthy companion. The PAS3 stereo preamplifier, a full-featured tube preamplifier, with phono equalization tone controls and input switching, was available as a Dynakit for approximately $40 and as a factory-assembled unit for roughly $60. Add the FM3 stereo tuner, also available in kit form, and a complete Dynaco high-fidelity system amplifier, preamplifier tuner, could be assembled from kits for under $200. Under $200 in 1963 was roughly 2 months' wages for a factory worker in Philadelphia. It was not nothing, but it was reachable. And what it delivered once assembled and connected to a pair of capable loudspeakers was indistinguishable in any meaningful listening sense from what a system costing $500 or more would deliver. Lafayette Radio Electronics was the retail infrastructure that made this possible at scale. With locations across the northeastern United States and a national mail-order catalog that reached buyers in every state, Lafayette carried the full Dynaco line and stocked Dynakit components at its counter. A buyer who had read about the ST70 and radio electronics could walk into a Lafayette store the same week, handle the assembled version, ask questions of the counter staff, and walk out with the kit the same afternoon. What was in that chassis that a manufacturer spending 10 times the money could not quite reproduce? The answer was not a circuit. It was a philosophy, the conviction that the person on the other side of the transaction deserved the best available performance at the lowest achievable price, with enough documentation to build it themselves if they chose. And in 1963, that philosophy was about to meet its largest audience yet. There was a phrase that circulated in American hi-fi circles throughout the 1960s, passed between audiophiles at dealers and in the letters pages of audio and high-fidelity magazines, spoken without condescension and received without offense. The phrase was, "the poor man's Macintosh." It was applied to the Dynaco ST70, and it meant something precise. A Macintosh MC30 monaural amplifier, 30 watts point-to-point, wiring, the legendary Blue meters, the build quality that Macintosh had made its signature, sold in the early 1960s for well over $200 per channel. A stereo pair cost more than $400 before a preamplifier or speakers entered the calculation. The MC-30 was a magnificent piece of American engineering, and its price reflected both the cost of building it and the market's willingness to pay for the name. The listeners who owned Macintosh systems were not wrong. The equipment deserved its reputation. The ST70 kit cost $99.95. For a listener who built it himself, that was the entire amplifier. Both channels, all 35 watts per side, the same ultra-linear output transformers, the same EL34 tubes, the same measured performance that High Fidelity magazine had described as unsurpassed in its listening quality. The gap between what the ST70 delivered and what the Macintosh delivered was real, but narrow enough that a careful listener sitting in front of a well-assembled Dynaco system could close his eyes and understand why the phrase had entered the vocabulary. Poor man's Macintosh was not an insult. It was a verdict. It said the performance is here, the price is here, and the distance between those two facts represents something that one company understood and most others did not. By the early 1960s, the ST70 was not only selling throughout the United States, it had crossed both oceans. American servicemen stationed in Europe and Japan had brought Dynakit catalogs with them, or had encountered the amplifier through the network of American military exchange stores that stocked consumer electronics. European audiophiles accustomed to paying British or German premium prices for comparable performance discovered that a Dynaco system represented an argument they could not easily counter. The ST70 sold well in Britain, in Germany, and in Japan markets, where the brand had no advertising presence and no dealer network to speak of, and where its reputation traveled entirely by word of mouth and trade press coverage. In America, the audience for the Dynaco system was specific and identifiable. It was not the physician with the Macintosh and the Thorens turntable. It was the school teacher in a two-bedroom house in suburban Philadelphia who had grown up listening to his parents' radio and had decided in his late 20s that he wanted to hear music the way it actually sounded. It was the graduate student in a Cambridge apartment who had read the High Fidelity review and concluded that $99 and a weekend of careful work was a reasonable price for the listening experience it would produce. It was the factory worker in Cleveland who had never been inside a high-end audio salon in his life and had no intention of starting now, but who had built radios as a teenager and saw no reason why the same principle should not apply to a stereo amplifier. These were not marginal customers. They were, by the mid-1960s, the American hi-fi market, and the Dynaco ST70 was the amplifier that had made them part of it. What was about to happen to that market, and to the company that had done more than any other to create it, was already being decided in boardrooms that had never housed a listening room, by men who had never built anything on a kitchen table. In 1969, Dynaco introduced a loudspeaker. This was not an obvious move for a company whose identity was built entirely on amplification electronics. But Ed Laurent, the engineer who had co-founded the company with Hafler in 1955, and who had remained at Dynaco through the first year of Tyco's ownership, understood that the mission of the company was not to sell amplifiers. It was to put a complete, high-quality listening system within reach of the American buyer who could not otherwise access one. The amplifier and preamplifier were already there. The tuner was there. What remained was the loudspeaker, the final component in the chain, and traditionally one of the most expensive. Laurent did not design the speaker himself. He sourced it. A Danish engineer named Eivind Skanning, working in collaboration with the Norwegian driver manufacturer Sees, had developed a two-way bookshelf loudspeaker of exceptional measured performance and natural uncolored sound. The design used a 10-inch paper cone woofer and a 1.5-inch soft dome tweeter, a tweeter material that was in 1969 still uncommon in American loudspeakers at any price. Skanning's crossover network was simple, well executed, and voiced for a warmth and coherence that complemented rather than competed with the character of a tube amplifier. Dynaco brought the design to North America under its own name. The A25 was sold in the United States and Canada as the Dynaco A25. The same speaker was sold in Scandinavia as the Scandyna A25. It was a design sourced internationally and distributed through Dynaco's American network. Not an American manufactured product, but an American commercial proposition priced and packaged by an American company for an American market. The price at introduction was $79 per speaker. In December 1969, J. Gordon Holt reviewed the A25 in Stereophile, the magazine he had founded 7 years earlier, after growing dissatisfied with the advertiser-accommodating atmosphere at high fidelity. Holt was not a gentle critic. His reviews were precise, demanding, and frequently unflattering to products that arrived with large reputations and modest performance. His A25 review changed the trajectory of the speaker's commercial life in the United States almost immediately. Audio Magazine followed with its own assessment, concluding that the A25 had produced the finest tone burst response of any speaker it had tested in that manner, regardless of price. Consumer Reports named it its top-rated bookshelf speaker. That last endorsement reached an audience that neither Stereophile nor audio could access the mainstream American buyer who did not read audiophile publications, but did read Consumer Reports, who trusted its ratings the way an earlier generation had trusted the Sears catalog. Across the country, buyers arrived at hi-fi dealers with the Consumer Reports issue folded in a back pocket, asking specifically for the A25 by name. Ed Laurent would later count the total worldwide sales of the A25 at more than 1 million units. It was the most commercially successful product Dynaco ever sold, designed in Denmark, built with Norwegian drivers, distributed by a company in Philadelphia, and heard in living rooms across 6 continents. By 1970, the complete Dynaco system ST70 amplifier, PAS3, preamplifier, FM3 tuner, A, 25 loudspeakers could be assembled for under $300, including the cost of buying the amplifier and preamplifier fully factory assembled rather than in kit form. It was not the only high-fidelity system available at that price. It was the best one. The trade press had said so. The sales figures confirmed it. And in living rooms from Boston to Los Angeles, from Minneapolis to Atlanta, the evidence was audible every evening when someone put a record on the turntable and turned up the volume. This was the peak. The amplifier that had started in a chocolate factory on Powelton Avenue had become the backbone of American domestic hi-fi at the moment when American domestic hi-fi mattered most. The company that built it was no longer independent, and the men now responsible for it were about to demonstrate in careful institutional steps exactly what they did not understand about what they owned. To understand what happened to Dynaco after 1968, it is necessary to understand what Tyco Laboratories was and what it was not. Tyco Laboratories was a diversified technology conglomerate headquartered in New Hampshire. It had begun in the early 1960s as a modest scientific research company and had transformed itself over the course of a single decade into an acquisition vehicle of considerable ambition and no particular industrial focus. Its strategy was the defining corporate strategy of the American 1960s. Identify profitable companies in fragmented markets, acquire them at reasonable multiples, fold them into a diversified portfolio, and extract value through centralized management and cost discipline. The logic was not cynical. It was by the standards of the era considered sophisticated. The conglomerate model had been validated by business schools, celebrated in the financial press, and rewarded by stock markets that assigned premium valuations to diversified earnings streams. In 1968 alone, Tyco acquired 6 companies. The list is worth reading in full because the list is the argument. Electrolab Electronics Corporation, AirSpec Incorporated, Explosive Fabricators Corporation, Dynaco Incorporated, Coating Products Incorporated, Digital Devices Incorporated. These 6 companies made respectively electronic components, industrial air systems devices for the controlled detonation of explosives, high-fidelity audio equipment, industrial surface coatings, and digital measurement instruments. In the Tyco annual report, they occupied adjacent lines. In the real world, they had nothing in common except profitability. Dynaco's profitability was genuine and documented. The ST-70 had been in continuous production for 9 years. The PAS-3 preamplifier was among the best-selling audio components in the American market. The A25 loudspeaker program was just beginning, and its commercial potential was already visible. A company acquiring Dynaco in 1968 was acquiring a brand with demonstrated market penetration, a loyal customer base, a strong dealer network through channels like Lafayette Radio, and a product philosophy that had proven itself across 13 years of operation. What that company was also acquiring, and what does not appear in any acquisition analysis, because it cannot be expressed in the language that acquisition analyses use, was a method, a way of building things. The pre-assembled circuit board that eliminated the most error-prone step in kit construction. The instruction manual written for an intelligent adult rather than a trained technician. The ultralinear output transformer wound to specifications that Hafler and Laurent had developed and refined over more than a decade of listening. The institutional knowledge carried in the hands and habits of the people on the Powelton Avenue production floor who knew which solder joint needed a second pass and which component tolerance mattered most at the final listening check. None of this appeared on a balance sheet. All of it was real. David Hafler remained with the company in an advisory capacity after the sale, a transitional arrangement that lasted until approximately 1974. His presence provided continuity, but advisory capacity is not operational authority, and the decisions that would determine Dynaco's trajectory under Tyco were not decisions that Hafler was positioned to prevent. He had signed the company over. The conglomerate now managed it. The first visible consequence of Tyco's ownership was not a product change. It was a geography change. Around 1973, Dynaco's manufacturing operations were relocated from 3912 Powelton Avenue in Philadelphia, the former chocolate factory, the walk-in refrigerator listening room, the address that had appeared in every Dynaco advertisement since the late 1950s, to Blackwood, New Jersey, a suburban community approximately 15 miles southeast of Philadelphia, on the other side of the Delaware River. The relocation made sense in the language of facilities management. The Powelton Avenue building was aging. New Jersey offered newer industrial space at lower cost. The move consolidated operations and reduced overhead. On a spreadsheet, it was a defensible decision. What a spreadsheet cannot capture is what a factory move costs in the currency that craft manufacturing actually runs on. The workers who had spent years on the Powelton Avenue floor did not all follow the company to Blackwood. Some did, some did not. The informal networks of quality knowledge, the understanding of which component batches ran high and which ran low, the listening judgment that caught a marginal unit before it left the building, the institutional memory of what the product was supposed to sound like, these did not transfer automatically with the equipment. They lived in people. And when the people changed, the knowledge began to dissipate in ways that no process document could fully compensate for. The solid-state transition compounded the pressure. By the early 1970s, the American consumer electronics market was moving decisively away from tube amplification and towards solid-state transistor-based designs. Japanese manufacturers, led by companies like Sony Pioneer and Sansui, were producing solid-state receivers and integrated amplifiers of improving quality at prices that undercut American equivalents with increasing authority. A solid-state receiver from a Japanese manufacturer available at a mid-sized American department store or through a discount electronics chain could deliver acceptable stereo performance for less than the cost of a Dynaco kit system. It was not the same performance. But for a buyer who had not grown up with the Dynakit tradition, who had not built a Mark III on his kitchen table in 1961, who simply wanted music in the living room at a manageable price, the Japanese receiver was easier, more convenient, and cheaper. Dynaco attempted to respond. The company introduced solid-state amplifiers and integrated units, the Stereo 120, the SCA-80, designed to compete in the solid-state market while maintaining the Dynaco value proposition. The Dynaquad system, introduced in the early 1970s, was Hafler's own design, a passive matrix approach to quadraphonic sound that derived ambient rear-channel information from the different signal in an ordinary stereo recording without requiring special recordings or additional amplifier channels. It was elegant, inexpensive, and genuinely effective at what it claimed to do. It was also a solution to a problem that the American consumer market had not yet decided it wanted solved, arriving at a moment when the company's energy and resources were increasingly constrained by the demands of operating as a division within a conglomerate portfolio. What exactly did Tyco Laboratories think it had purchased in 1968? The evidence suggests it purchased a revenue stream. What it had actually acquired was a philosophy, and philosophies do not survive portfolio management. By the mid-1970s, the gap between what Dynaco had been and what Dynaco was becoming was audible to anyone who had been paying attention. The trade press had begun to notice. The audiophile community had begun to talk. And the amplifier that had defined the category, the ST70, still in production at the Blackwood facility, still carrying the same model designation, still using the same circuit, was approaching the end of its run under conditions that David Hafler, sitting in Philadelphia, had not designed it to endure. The end of the Dynaco ST70, in its original form, came in 1977, not with an announcement, not with a press release or a farewell advertisement in Audio magazine. The production run simply stopped, as production runs do when the institutional will to continue them is no longer present, and the market signals no longer justify the investment required to maintain them. For 18 years, the ST70 had been in continuous production longer than most American consumer products of any kind, and longer by a considerable margin than any comparable tube amplifier from any comparable manufacturer. It had outlasted companies, outlasted trends, and outlasted the enthusiasm of the American consumer electronics market for the technology it embodied. In 1977, it did not outlast Tyco's patience. The discontinuation of the ST70 was a signal, though it was not recognized as such by everyone who should have recognized it. What it said in the language that corporate decisions speak was this: the product that had defined the company for nearly 2 decades was no longer considered worth the cost of producing. The brand would continue. The Dynaco name would remain on solid-state amplifiers and integrated units and whatever else the product development team in Blackwood could bring to market under the conglomerate's budget constraints. But the specific thing that had made the brand mean something, the tube amplifier, the kit model, the ultra-linear transformer, the EL34 output stage, the philosophy made physical in a chassis that a working American could build on his kitchen table, that was finished. The audiophile community noticed before the trade press formally documented it. In the letters pages of Stereophile and Audio, in the conversations at hi-fi shops and audio club meetings, a quiet but consistent complaint was emerging. The new Dynaco products did not carry the authority of the old ones. The solid-state amplifiers were competent but undistinguished. The kit experienced the specific satisfaction of the Dynakit, build the clarity of the instructions, the sense that the company had designed the product with the builder's experience in mind was diminishing. The covenant that Hafler had established between the company and its customers in 1955 was eroding under the weight of quarterly earnings targets and portfolio management priorities that had no particular interest in covenants. And what exactly had Tyco purchased? Not a circuit. Circuits can be copied, not a transformer specification. Specifications can be documented. What Tyco had purchased was the trust of an audience that had spent 15 years demonstrating its loyalty by building Dynaco products on kitchen tables and recommending them to neighbors and colleagues and writing about them in letters to audio magazines. That trust was not renewable on demand. It had been built slowly, product by product, manual page by manual page, over 13 years of operation before the sale. And it was being spent at a rate that no quarterly report was designed to measure. By 1979, Tyco had seen enough. The conglomerate divested Dynaco to ESS Laboratories, a California-based speaker manufacturer that had built a reputation on its own product line and had, for reasons that the historical record does not fully illuminate, concluded that the Dynaco brand represented a recoverable asset worth acquiring. ESS was not a conglomerate. It was a company that understood audio equipment. But understanding audio equipment and understanding what Dynaco specifically required to function were not the same knowledge, and ESS's ownership proved it. ESS could not make the Dynaco division profitable. The brand's identity had been built on a kit model and a tube amplifier that were both now discontinued. The solid-state product line that remained bore the Dynaco name, but not the Dynaco proposition. A buyer walking into a hi-fi store in 1979 and comparing a Dynaco solid-state integrated amplifier against a comparable unit from Pioneer or Kenwood or Sansui was not comparing a premium product against a mass-market alternative. He was comparing two mass-market alternatives, one of which carried a name that had once meant something and one of which did not. In that comparison, the name alone was not sufficient. The name had never been the product. The product had been the product. In 1980, ESS closed the Dynaco division. The Blackwood, New Jersey facility, the factory that Tyco had built to replace the chocolate factory on Powelton Avenue. The facility that had produced the final years of the ST70, and the solid-state products that had failed to replace it, was shuttered. The assets were sold. Every remaining piece of the company that had once been the most popular tube amplifier manufacturer in the history of American high fidelity, the parts inventory, the remaining kit stock, the tooling, the brand rights, the documentation was purchased by a discount electronics retailer called Stereo Cost Cutters, also known as Sound Values, operating out of Columbus, Ohio. Stereo Cost Cutters maintained the existing kit inventory for as long as stock lasted. They did not develop new products. They did not restore the kit model. They did not attempt to reconnect with the audience that Hafler had spent 13 years building. They sold what remained until it was gone. The company that had started in a converted chocolate factory that had produced more than 350,000 ST70 amplifiers and contributed to the sale of more than 1 million 25 loudspeakers that had put serious sound into living rooms across the United States and across the world for 25 years, ended its operational life as a lot sale to a discount retailer. The last batch left Blackwood. The brand changed hands in Columbus. The name was still out there. The factory was not. The workers dispersed. The tooling went dark. The chocolate factory on Powelton Avenue had long since become something else. And the walk-in refrigerator that had served as Dynaco's first listening room was gone without a trace. The sound, however, was another matter entirely. A brand name that has meant something does not disappear cleanly. It persists in the memories of the people who built the products, in the hands of the collectors who preserved them, and in the calculations of entrepreneurs who look at a name with residual recognition and conclude that the recognition itself has value independent of the operation that originally created it. The Dynaco name passed through several such calculations after 1980. Stereo cost cutters and its Sound Values retail operation maintained the remaining Dynaco kit inventory. Through the early 1980s, selling off existing stock without modification or development. When the inventory was exhausted, the kits were gone. What remained was the trademark and whatever goodwill the trademark still carried in the audiophile community, which, as it turned out, was considerably more than the discount retail context suggested. Around 1990, a company called Pan Orient Corporation, later reorganized as Pan Or Corporation, operating out of Hauppauge, New York, acquired the rights to the Dynaco name and attempted a more substantive revival. Pan Or introduced a revised PAS 3 Series 2 preamplifier, a CD player line, designated the CDV series, and a reissued tube stereo amplifier called the Stereo 72. The latter produced for Pan Or by a company called Sound Valves. The Stereo 72 used the Dynaco ST70 circuit as its foundation, but incorporated updated components and a revised driver board intended to address the known limitations of the original 7199 driver tube, which had become increasingly difficult to source in reliable quantities. The Pan Or revival was genuine in its intentions and limited in its execution. The products were real, and some of them were reasonably well regarded in the budget audiophile segment. But the context had changed irrevocably. The kit model, the specific innovation that had made Dynaco's original proposition work, that had allowed the company to deliver high-fidelity performance at low prices by eliminating factory assembly costs and passing the savings to the builder, was not restored. The Pan Or products were assembled goods, at assembled prices, competing in a market that had moved substantially since 1980, and that now included a wide range of imported tube amplifiers from Chinese and Eastern European manufacturers offering competitive performance at comparable or lower prices. Pan Or's operation did not survive the decade. By the late 1990s, it had ceased production. The Dynaco trademark subsequently passed to Radial Engineering Limited, a Canadian professional audio equipment manufacturer. Radial produced a modernized version of the ST70, the ST70 Series 3, with a new circuit design reviewed by The Absolute Sound and other publications as a legitimate engineering effort that paid serious attention to the original's virtues while correcting its documented weaknesses. The Series 3 was not a nostalgia product. It was a real amplifier built by a company that understood what it was attempting. But it was a Canadian product bearing a Philadelphia name, built by an organization with no connection to the Powelton Avenue factory, the Blackwood facility, or the specific institutional knowledge that had made the original what it was. The collector market rendered its verdict without ambiguity. Original Dynaco ST70 units in good condition, and there are many of them still operating because the circuit is robust and the construction is repairable, sell on eBay and Reverb. COM4 prices that routinely exceed what the assembled Dynaco unit cost at original retail adjusted for inflation. Restored examples rebuilt with premium components and updated driver boards by specialist technicians command prices that reflect not merely the cost of restoration, but the specific value of the original transformer, the original chassis, the original circuit running in the configuration that Hafler and Laurent and Tucker designed in 1958. The transformer is the irreplaceable element. The Dynaco, a 470 ultralinear output transformer. The specific component that gave the ST70 its sonic character is being reproduced today by boutique transformer winders who have studied the original specifications and winding geometry and concluded that the effort is worthwhile. The factory that wound the originals has been gone for 45 years. The transformer itself has outlasted the company that designed it. David Hafler did not wait for the revivals. He did not need to. Within a few years of leaving Dynaco's advisory role, he had founded a new company under his own name, the David Hafler Company, with the same mission that had animated every enterprise he had ever built: high-quality audio performance at a price that did not require wealth to access. The Hafler DH200 stereo power amplifier, introduced in the late 1970s, was the first amplifier using a MOSFET output stage to be marketed commercially in the United States. MOSFET metal oxide semiconductor field effect transistor output devices offered a combination of linearity, reliability, and thermal stability that Hafler had identified as the solid-state equivalent of what the EL34 had provided in the tube domain. The DH200 was reviewed with considerable enthusiasm. The mission had not ended with the sale in 1968. It had simply moved to a different address. In 1988, at the Summer Consumer Electronics Show, the Major Armstrong Foundation presented David Hafler with its Man of High Fidelity Award, the most significant recognition in the American audio industry, for lifetime contribution to the field. He was 69 years old. He had spent nearly 4 decades building affordable high-fidelity equipment, and the industry had finally found the right occasion to say so formally. He died on May 25, 2003 in Philadelphia. He was 84 years old. He had been born in the same city. He had never really left it. What Dynaco actually achieved is not fully captured by any single number, though the numbers are worth stating plainly. More than 350,000 ST70 amplifiers sold over 18 years of continuous production. More than 1,025,000 loudspeakers distributed worldwide. A complete high-fidelity system amplifier, preamplifier, tuner speakers available to the American buyer for under $300 at the company's commercial peak. These are not small figures. In the context of a consumer electronics market that had been structured since its inception around the proposition that serious performance required serious expenditure, they represent something closer to a refutation. The refutation was not accidental. It was the product of a specific philosophy held by a specific man, executed through a specific business model that no one had quite tried before and that no subsequent revival has fully replicated. The pre-assembled circuit board, the instruction manual written for an intelligent adult, the ultralinear output transformer wound to a specification that Hafler had refined over years of listening. The conviction stated explicitly in Dynaco's own advertising and implicit in every product the company shipped that the person on the other side of the transaction deserved the best available performance at the lowest achievable price, and that the gap between those two things was an engineering problem, not a market condition. That philosophy did not survive the conglomerate. It did not survive the factory relocation. It did not survive the transition from tube to solid state, or the sequential ownership of Tyco and ESS and the discount retailers who followed. But it survived in the equipment itself, in the specific physical, irreplaceable objects that Dynaco's customers had built on their kitchen tables and installed in their living rooms, and maintained and repaired and passed on to sons and daughters who had grown up listening through them. Today, the restoration and modification community built around the Dynaco ST70 is one of the most active in the vintage audio world. Companies like Bob Latino's Dynaco Tube Audio Supply updated driver boards, premium component kits, and complete restoration packages designed to bring original ST70 units to a standard of performance that exceeds what was achievable with the components available in 1959. Frank Van Alstyne's Audio by Van Alstyne has offered upgraded Dynaco preamplifier circuits since 1979, a modification business that has now outlasted the original manufacturer by more than 4 decades. Dozens of smaller specialist technicians across the United States offer ST70 restoration services, and the market for their work is not diminishing. It is by most accounts growing, fed by a new generation of listeners who have discovered that the amplifier their father or grandfather built on a kitchen table in 1963 still sounds like something worth preserving. The physical address of 3912 Powelton Avenue in Philadelphia no longer houses an amplifier manufacturer. The Powelton Village neighborhood has changed substantially since the 1950s. It is now largely residential adjacent to the expanding campuses of Drexel University and the University of Pennsylvania. Its Victorian row houses, occupied by students and faculty, and the various service businesses that surround a large urban university. The former chocolate factory, if it still stands in any recognizable form, carries no marker, identifying it as the place where the best-selling tube amplifier in American history was designed and first manufactured. Cities do not generally mark the addresses where affordable things were made. They mark the addresses where important people lived. The distinction says something. Where does a sound go when the factory that made it is gone? It goes into the equipment that left the factory before the doors closed. It goes into the hands of the people who learned to restore that equipment and into the ears of the people who sit down in front of it and understand sometimes for the first time what the argument was about. It goes into the transformer, the specific wound-to-specification ultralinear Dynaco A470 output transformer, still being reproduced by boutique vendors today because the original cannot be replaced by anything that does not take its design seriously. The factory is gone. The transformer is not. Dynaco's story is not finally a story about corporate betrayal, though the corporate betrayal is real and documented. It is not a story about the decline of American manufacturing, though the decline is real, and the Dynaco trajectory traces it precisely. It is a story about a democratic proposition, the belief that serious sound belongs to anyone willing to spend a weekend building it, and about what happens to democratic propositions when they become profitable enough to attract the attention of people whose primary relationship to democracy is as a market segment. The proposition was right. The market confirmed it 350,000 amplifiers at a time. What the market could not protect was the institution that had made the proposition physical. If you still have one working or not, you know what it sounds like. And if you built it yourself on a kitchen table following an instruction manual that assumed you were intelligent enough to do the job, then you know something else, that the man who wrote that manual believed in you before you had done anything to deserve it. That is not a common thing. It was not common in 1959. It is not common now. Somewhere in America tonight, an ST-70 is glowing in the dark. The tubes are warm. The transformer is doing what the transformer was designed to do, converting the signal, shaping the harmonic content, delivering 35 watts per channel into a pair of speakers that are filling a room with sound at a quality that David Hafler, sitting in a walk-in refrigerator on Powelton Avenue in 1958, would have recognized immediately as the thing he had set out to build. The chocolate factory is gone. The Blackwood plant is gone. The Dynakit box and the kitchen table and the 3-day build are 60 years in the past. The sound is here. It stayed. It is still the best argument the company ever made. If this story of American craftsmanship and democratic sound reached you today, consider subscribing to Forgotten Instruments. There are more stories like this one, waiting about the companies that built things worth remembering and the decisions that ended them. See you in the next one.